Welcome back, artists. Picking up where we left off, I was just noting that we don't want to get these generic sort of dog bone shapes. If we've got, like, say, a leg bone, a thigh, something looking far more realistic, like, say, this, a little less symmetrical, a little less idealized. That bone with all its complexity, that's how we're going to draw it. So aside from these like marshmallows that we don't want, a vertebrae, each vertebrae will be its own sort of little drawing like this. They'll be different for all animals, but you might get one vertebrae after another with far more complex shapes than you'd expect. That is how we want to draw them. We want to get that level of realism, okay? So let's pick up where we left off. Next, I'm going to consider construction as I start creating my my skeletal structure. And construction means drawing with shapes and giving them a sense of dimension even before they're shaded. So if I put a rib cage on here, well, I know that the rib cage has to basically protect the internal organs through the lungs and the heart. So while I might have shoulder blades that need to line up with, say, these points in the shoulders, the rib cage then is going to extend all the way down. And I can try to bisect it accurately like this. We know that there'll be a little less exposed ribs to the right because that part of the body is facing away from us. And then I could branch the ribs off like this. And I want to be so accurate as to notice, like in human ribs, for example, they slant down more drastically as you move from top down. So I'm going to show that in my design. And I want to make certain I get that same number on left and right. And then later I'll go in and I'll refine each bone separately. Try to get the accurate shape connected. And in the end, of course, just to prove a point here, I won't have exposed backbone through this whole part. It'll just be glimpsing through these sort of ribs, if that makes sense, right? Okay, so next then, right, like I want to make certain that like I've got a functioning body here too. So let's also start eclipsing this structure with like leg bones. And if the joints are here in each leg, my leg bones need to feed into the pelvis. So I'm going to check out and look what those look like in my references. Then I want them to meet here. And it needs to look like they're actually fitting together and bending. So it's almost like a sort of joint socket here, right? It needs to work like a hinge so we can see how the top and the bottom bend with one another around that ball joint. Ball joint, that's the word I was looking for. To allow for movement, right? And this part of the leg would be hidden behind, but this part comes down, meets that ball joint. And of course, I'm using references for this, don't forget. I don't just want to estimate this. I'm looking at what ball joints and leg bones might look like on a human and then say like also an anteater. And I'm even making sure that these line up. You can see I'm angle checking to make certain that the limbs bend in the correct places. Let's pump the brakes there for now. Like before we part ways, let me just remind you too that when you're doing, say, like hand bones, it can be tempting to just do this. But in reality, you got to get each of those little bones too, where you see them meet, however many joints you see. You want to show us every single bone you can muster for each bent finger. Get that level of detail. This is the basic way to break down the larger shapes, working big to small. But once the broad strokes are there, or as my professor used to say, once the cake is baked, you can go in and frost and add those little details, all right? I'll leave you to it, and I'll check in on your work next class.